Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. In Genoa City, tension thickened the air like storm clouds gathering above the Newman Ranch, and the mood across town shifted as rumors spread that something terrible was unfolding behind closed doors, a nightmare that few could comprehend, and even fewer could stop, as Barrow's fragile psyche finally snapped after weeks of spiraling paranoia, obsession, and fear that he was losing the last grasp of control over his life, his freedom, and the people who stood in judgment against him, especially Sharon, who had unknowingly become the target of his unraveling emotional state. And it began innocently enough, a confrontation, a conversation, just another argument in a long soap opera history of twisting fates. But Barrow's eyes, dark and distant, held something chilling that Sharon sensed the moment she saw him, knowing instantly that this was not just another confrontation between troubled acquaintances but a moment where life, death, and destiny collided in a single breath that she could neither predict nor escape. And as he cornered her in the dimly lit room, Sharon steadied her voice and tried not to reveal the fear rising inside her chest. But Barrow was beyond reason, pacing, sweating, talking to himself in fragmented sentences as though he were battling voices only he could hear. Voices convincing him that everything was slipping away, that everyone was turning against him, that Sharon held information that would seal his fate forever. And she tried to calm him, to remind him that she had no reason to hurt him, that she had always tried to show empathy, compassion, and understanding even when the world turned its back. But Barrow had allowed his fear and rage to metastasize into something darker, a storm too violent to contain, and he snapped, grabbing the gun hidden in his waistband, raising it with trembling hands as Sharon stared at the weapon in disbelief, understanding in that moment that not only her life but the future of everyone connected to her hung on a thread thinner than a whisper. And she slowly raised her hands, trying to soften her tone, trying to reach whatever part of Barrow still remembered humanity, still remembered boundaries, still remembered that violence was not the answer. But Barrow's eyes glazed with a cold determination that made her realize the man she once knew had checked out long before this moment, replaced by someone desperate, unhinged, and terrified of what he perceived as inevitable downfall. And he began ranting about how everyone was laughing at him, that Sharon had betrayed him, that she was the final piece of the conspiracy he believed surrounded him. And she tried to break through the fog of delusion, saying gently that no one was out to destroy him, that the only enemy was the fear controlling him. But the words bounced off like pebbles against steel, unable to penetrate the fortress of paranoia that had consumed him. And as the minutes dragged on, Sharon's composure wavered, but she refused to surrender to panic, even as Barrow stepped closer, waving the gun as though it were merely an extension of his fractured emotions. And somewhere outside, in another part of town, the lives of Nick, Mariah, Faith, and everyone who loved Sharon continued without knowledge that the heartbeat of their world was now seconds from ending. Yet fate had its own plans, dark threads weaving into a moment that would soon shatter the hearts of Genoa City forever. And Barrow, now breathing heavily, as though the air itself threatened to suffocate him, began reminiscing about all the times he felt overlooked, dismissed, treated like a problem rather than a human being. And Sharon, knowing her survival hinged on keeping him talking, encouraged him gently, hoping to buy time, hoping someone would walk through that door, hoping for a miracle. But Barrow's grip tightened and his voice dropped to a whisper, almost eerily calm, the kind of stillness that signals the moment before a fire explodes into uncontrolled destruction. And Sharon realized she was looking into the eyes of a man who believed he had nothing left to lose and therefore could take anything, including her life. And the terror of that realization hit her like a blow to the chest. Yet she refused to let her voice shake, refused to break down even as she felt tears sting her eyes, not from fear of death but from fear of leaving her family behind, from fear that they would never have the chance to tell her how much she meant to them. And Barrow paused, staring into her eyes as though searching for something, maybe a sign of guilt, remorse, understanding, or recognition. And Sharon, leaning into every ounce of her empathy, whispered that she could help him, that he could put the gun down, that it was not too late, that a different path still existed. But Barrow began shaking his head violently, saying over and over that it was already too late, that the decision had been made, that the world had forced his hand. And as he lifted the gun fully and pointed it directly between Sharon's eyes, she felt her breath catch in her throat, and she whispered his name one last time, hoping it would reach some broken part of him lost inside the chaos. But Barrow's mouth twisted into a haunting expression, somewhere between a smile, a grimace, and a resigned acceptance, and he uttered 3 chilling final words that would echo in Sharon's mind even as her future hung in the balance. The 3 words reverberated like a death knell, a sound that seemed to pull the air from the room itself, leaving Sharon frozen yet hyper-aware, every nerve screaming, every thought racing, every heartbeat pounding as Barrow's finger tightened on the trigger, the metallic scent of danger and adrenaline mingling with the stale air in the small space. And in that split second Sharon's mind catalogued every memory, every conversation, every laugh, every tear, and yet all she could do was breathe. Through the terror, trying desperately to stay present, to stay alive, knowing that one wrong move, one twitch, one hint of panic could trigger the final irreversible act, and Barrow, consumed by a storm of rage, insecurity, and desperation, took a step closer, his breathing ragged, uneven, as though his body and soul were no longer aligned, while Sharon tried to maintain a calm she did not feel, her voice barely above a whisper, soothing, pleading, humanizing, trying to reach the man who had been trapped behind layers of fear and madness, telling him that shooting her would not bring the peace he sought, that violence would not solve the torment that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Yet Barrow shook his head violently, muttering fragments of sentences that made no sense to anyone else but to him, fragments of imagined betrayals, slights, and conspiracies, and Sharon, sensing that words alone might not be enough, slowly inched backward, careful to keep her movements non-threatening, careful to avoid any sudden gestures that might be interpreted as a threat, and all the while Barrow's eyes darted to the sides, to corners, as though invisible enemies surrounded them, shadows moving in his mind that had no physical form, and each flash of fear, each flicker of anger, each glimpse of paranoia made the room feel smaller, more suffocating, and the tension grew like a living creature, coiling and tightening around them both, until even the faintest creak of the floorboards outside the door felt like the footsteps of fate, marching toward inevitable disaster, and Sharon, knowing that time was slipping away, tried another tactic, softer this time, more intimate, speaking of shared memories, moments of vulnerability she had once seen in him, hoping to remind him that he had been more than this, that he had once been capable of kindness, trust, and love, hoping to spark even the tiniest crack in the armor of his delusion. But Barrow's finger trembled, not from hesitation, but from the raw intensity of his belief that the only solution left was destruction, and the gun shook in his hand, the metallic click of the safety a cruel rhythm that punctuated the silence, each tick of the imagined clock in his mind echoing louder and louder, and Sharon, her chest tight, whispered that she could help him escape the trap he had built around himself, that they could walk away from this together, that she would not judge, that she would not abandon him, that whatever darkness had consumed him did not define him entirely. But Barrow, eyes wide and unblinking, barked a laugh that was half hysteria, half despair, and told her that it was too late for mercy, too late for compassion, that the die had been cast, that destiny had spoken, and Sharon, her thoughts racing faster than her heartbeat, realized she had only one chance left, a single infinitesimal moment to act, to survive, to turn fate aside, and she took a calculated step, an almost imperceptible motion designed to buy a millisecond of control, and Barrow, reacting with the reflexes of someone who had already surrendered to madness, lifted the gun higher, eyes locked on hers with a terrifying clarity that made the world fall away, and in that terrifying instant Sharon's mind split between action and surrender, between fear and strategy, between life and death, and somewhere in the echoing recesses of Barrow's mind, a conflict raged that mirrored the storm in the room, as though two separate worlds, one of reason, one of rage, fought violently for dominance, and Sharon, sensing the tiniest hint of hesitation in that internal battle, seized the opportunity to speak again, voice steady, full of empathy and conviction, reminding Barrow of every reason to stay, to pause, to breathe, to consider the aftermath of a single moment, of a single bullet, of a life ended prematurely. But the words, the pleas, the logic, collided with the wall of delusion he had constructed, and for an agonizing second, the room held its collective breath, a silent witness to the struggle between survival and self-destruction, and Barrow's hand wavered, not fully relinquishing the weapon, not fully surrendering to reason, and Sharon, sensing the tiniest opening, leaned slightly, subtly, carefully, her eyes never leaving his, and whispered one final appeal, a phrase meant to anchor him, to remind him of the humanity still within reach, still capable of choice, still capable of turning back. But before the words could fully land, before the gravity of her compassion could truly penetrate the storm, Barrow, overwhelmed by the cacophony of fear, anger, and imagined betrayal, pulled the trigger in a moment of horrifying clarity, the sound ripping through the room, echoing against walls, bouncing off every surface, a metallic scream that seemed to carry with it the weight of inevitability and terror, and Sharon felt the searing pain, the sharp, shocking force of impact as her world tilted violently, as reality fractured into jagged pieces. Yet in the midst of excruciating agony, her mind fought to cling to consciousness, to recall every scrap of training, instinct, and willpower that might allow her to survive, and Barrow, staggering back, hands shaking, eyes wide with immediate realization of what he had done, dropped the weapon, the echo of the shot still ringing in his ears, the enormity of his action crashing down upon him with the weight of irrevocable consequence. And in that chaotic, horrific instant, Sharon, gasping, bleeding, struggling to remain upright, reached for anything to stabilize herself, anything to hold on to life, to stay tethered to the world she loved and feared leaving, and Barrow, consumed with panic, remorse, and disbelief, knelt beside her, voice breaking, hands trembling, muttering apologies, excuses, confessions, but Sharon, her own strength waning, knew that words now could not undo what had happened, that survival would demand every ounce of courage, and even as darkness threatened at the edges of her vision, she focused on breath, on heartbeat, on the sound of her own life force reminding her that she was still, somehow, still alive, and somewhere outside, emergency responders were summoned, unaware of the intricate dance between life and death occurring inside, of the raw emotion, fear, and tragedy that had unfolded in a single room. And as Barrow crumpled into a chair, tears streaming, guilt washing over him like a tidal wave, Sharon felt a flicker of something extraordinary amidst the pain, a spark of survival, a whisper of hope that perhaps, despite the horror, she could survive, that perhaps the nightmare could end without claiming everything, that perhaps, even in the wake of devastation, the human heart could endure. And in the aftermath, the story of Barrow losing control, of Sharon being shot, of the chilling final words that haunted every corner of the room, would ripple through Genoa City, changing relationships, breaking hearts, and forcing every witness, every friend, every family member, every neighbor to confront the fragility of life, the unpredictability of human emotion, and the shocking, often terrifying power of desperation, fear, and unchecked obsession. And Sharon, her life hanging by a thread, understood in that moment that survival was not just a physical struggle but a battle of spirit, courage, and the unyielding will to live, and that the choices made in seconds could reverberate for a lifetime, shaping destinies, redefining love, trust, and the meaning of forgiveness. As Barrow, consumed by horror at what he had done, stared at the wreckage of his own making, a broken man haunted by the echoes of his own final words, knowing that nothing could ever restore what had been shattered, and that the consequences of losing control extended far beyond the room, beyond the lives directly touched, into the very fabric of the city, weaving fear, caution, and heartbreak into the tapestry of Genoa City forever. Even as the echoes of the gunshot faded into a heavy silence, the room remained thick with tension, a suffocating blend of pain, fear, and disbelief. And Sharon, her body trembling, blood seeping through her clothes, felt every second stretch into an eternity, the world reduced to the narrow focus of survival, to the primal determination to remain conscious, to fight against the dark pull that threatened to swallow her whole, while Barrow, knees shaking, eyes wide with the realization of the irreversible, sat frozen as though the act had rendered him immobile, paralyzed not by physical force but by the weight of guilt, horror, and the immediate recognition that the life he had tried to dominate with violence had fought back with raw, terrifying unpredictability. And outside, the city carried on oblivious to the intimate calamity, the small room becoming a universe unto itself, a place where time was measured in breaths, heartbeats, and the slow, agonizing ticking of trauma. And Sharon, every nerve ablaze with pain, remembered past moments in her life, every choice that had led her to this encounter, every friendship, every betrayal, every love, and she realized that though her body was compromised, her spirit remained fierce, stubborn, unwilling to yield, even as the edges of consciousness blurred and the room seemed to spin around her, every shadow twisting into something menacing, every sound exaggerated, amplified, until even the faintest whisper felt like a roar. A reminder of the fragility of life, the capriciousness of fate, and the shocking randomness of human cruelty. And Barrow, fully aware of the consequences, shook as he muttered apologies, confessions, incoherent ramblings. And Sharon, through the haze of pain, tried to focus, tried to anchor herself in the reality of survival, trying to remember the precise moments, the critical details, the skills that might save her life, while Barrow's voice, cracking with guilt and panic, filled the room. With echoes that seemed to mock the quiet desperation of the wounded, the helplessness of the innocent, the unimaginable devastation of impulsive actions, and Sharon, every muscle screaming, every thought racing, felt a surge of determination, a spark of instinctual survival, and she moved slightly, slowly, carefully, testing the limits of her body, gauging her strength, willing herself to keep breathing, to remain present, to refuse the darkness that threatened to consume her. While Barrow, still paralyzed by shock, barely noticed the subtle shifts, the slight motions that hinted that the life he had tried to extinguish was fighting back, and the room seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, a fragile, tense pause between chaos and the possibility of control, a moment suspended on the knife edge of fate, and Sharon, her mind a whirlwind of fear, strategy, and resolve, realized that the key to surviving this nightmare lay not just in physical action but in the management of the human mind, both her own and Barrow's, in understanding the psychology of desperation, rage, and guilt, in harnessing the flickering awareness that still lingered in Barrow, and in the calculated balance between movement and stillness, speech and silence, presence and withdrawal. And as the minutes stretched, she began to whisper softly, deliberately, words designed not just to soothe but to reach the fractured consciousness of a man on the brink, reminding him of shared histories, past kindnesses, and the basic humanity that had been buried beneath layers of fear, shame, and obsession. And Barrow, hearing the familiar cadence of her voice, felt a momentary flicker of recognition, a tiny spark of the man he once was, before paranoia and rage had taken over, and it was in that instant, delicate and fleeting, that Sharon made a subtle, almost imperceptible move to reach for the nearest object, something that could help stabilize her or defend herself if needed, all while maintaining an air of calm, a delicate balance that required every ounce of courage and focus she possessed. And Barrow, distracted by the sudden awareness of his own horror, did not notice the minute shifts, the careful positioning, the tactical patience that Sharon employed, and in that suspended moment, the room seemed both impossibly large and painfully small, a crucible of emotion, consequence, and raw human intensity, where life and death danced on a knife edge, where every thought mattered, where every heartbeat could determine survival or finality. And Sharon, her mind racing yet clear, focused not on the pain but on the calculation of every motion, every potential outcome, every possibility for survival. And Barrow, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he had done and what he might do next, finally lowered the gun slightly, not fully surrendering but caught in the gravity of the situation, caught in the weight of remorse, fear, and the realization that his actions had brought them to a point from which there was no easy return. And in that precarious moment, Sharon sensed the tiniest window, the merest hint of opportunity to regain control, to assert her will, to survive, and she began to speak again. Carefully, choosing each word with precision, empathy, and strategic intent, reminding Barrow of the potential for redemption, of the consequences of further violence, of the humanity that remained within him despite the chaos. And Barrow, wrestling with the conflicting forces inside him, hesitated, caught between the drive to destroy and the instinct to preserve. And it was in that hesitation, fragile and fleeting, that Sharon acted, moving just enough to reposition herself, to shift her weight, to prepare for what might be necessary, while maintaining eye contact, while maintaining the delicate balance that could mean the difference between life and death. And as the tension reached an almost unbearable peak, the sound of distant sirens began to pierce the heavy silence, the faint indication that the world outside was moving toward them, toward rescue. And Sharon, clinging to the promise that help was on the way, focused every ounce of her strength on staying conscious, on maintaining her presence, on ensuring that she could survive the next critical seconds, while Barrow, hearing the approaching emergency, was thrown into further disarray, panic and remorse colliding, threatening to overwhelm him completely. And Sharon, sensing that the final confrontation was near, whispered again, soft strategic words that spoke to fear, hope, guilt, and redemption all at once, attempting to anchor Barrow's mind, to draw him back from the precipice of uncontrollable action, to offer a path forward that did not involve further harm. Yet the room remained a pressure cooker of tension, fear, and desperation, every second pregnant with possibility. And Sharon, despite the physical agony, focused on the narrowest point of control she had, the thin margin between life and the catastrophic, knowing that her next choice could determine not just her survival but Barrow's ultimate fate. And as the sirens grew louder, closer, as the world outside prepared to intervene. Sharon's mind flickered with a mixture of fear, determination, and clarity, understanding that the story of this night, of Barrow losing control of the gunshot of her survival, would ripple through the city, leaving echoes in every corner of Genoa City, touching lives she could not yet see, shaping futures she could not yet know. But in that room, in that agonizing, suspended moment, it was simply a battle of wills, a battle of survival, a test of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable trauma. And Sharon, focused, resolute, refusing to surrender, prepared herself for the final phase of the ordeal, knowing that everything depended on her courage, her presence of mind, and the faint glimmer of humanity that still lingered within Barrow, teetering on the edge between complete destruction and the possibility, however slim, of redemption. And the room held its breath, the moment stretched into eternity, every heartbeat echoing the precariousness of life, the intensity of human emotion, and the terrifying unpredictability of a single moment when control is lost and survival hangs by the thinnest of threads.